This case was never meant to be opened. Welcome to Sherlock File. I am your host, Julian Whitmore. Drop your location in the comments. I read them all. Your presence means everything. Let's begin. Holmes had scarcely spoken the last words before he seized his coat from the peg with the abrupt energy of a hound that has caught the scent. There was in him at such moments a vitality so sudden and complete that one might have believed he had been transformed into another man. The languid philosopher of the hearth vanished. In his place stood the lean, eager hunter of truth, every faculty sharpened and every nerve alive. "You have the name of the intended victim?" said he. Pembroke moistened his lips. "Yes, it is Mr. Julius Amberley of Queen Anne Gate." Holmes cast a quick glance toward me. "You perceive, Watson, but how fortunate it is that our unknown author, if author he be, has not been content with prophecy alone, but has shown the bureaucratic habit of completeness." He turned again to our visitor. "And this Mr. Amberley, what manner of man is he?" "A retired undersecretary attached formerly to the India Office, wealthy, methodical, reclusive. He is not, so far as I know, a man of enemies." Holmes gave the faintest shrug. "There is no such creature in London as a man without enemies. There are only men who do not know them." He took up his hat and cane. "We shall begin at once. You will accompany us, Mr. Pembroke. Watson, if you please." I confess that my mind was in a whirl as we descended to the street. The fog had thickened until the lamps shone in pale aureoles, each ring of light floating in a yellow void. At the clatter of wheels and the cry of distant newsboys came to us muffled and uncertain, as though the city's voice had been wrapped in wool. Holmes hailed a hansom, and in a few moments we were rattling southward, Pembroke opposite us, and clutching his knees with the anxious rigidity of a man whose reason is strained to its utmost limit. Holmes had spread the document over his lap, and now reread it beneath the cab lamp with an attention so fixed that I did not venture to interrupt him. At last he folded it and slipped it into his inner pocket. "The wording is curious," said he. "In what respect?" I asked. "It has the dryness of official prose, yet twice it departs from its own tone. Observe. The deceased was found in his study at approximately 9:15, the window unlatched from within. No signs of forced entry. Entirely proper. But then later, the body displayed an expression of considerable astonishment. That is not the language of a registry clerk. It is the language of an observer impressed by the scene itself." "You mean the document was written by someone who had actually seen the body?" "I mean that the writer wished it to seem so. Whether he had seen it is another matter." Holmes leaned back. "There is also the selection of details. It tells us enough to alarm, but not enough to convict. It names the victim, states the hour, the room, the apparent impossibility of entry, and then closes with the phrase, 'Investigation pending supplementary witness examination.'" Pembroke shivered. "That was the part that chilled me most, as though everything were already in motion." Holmes looked at him keenly. "And why did you not go directly to the police?" The man hesitated. "Because my superior, Mr. Lethbridge, was in the archive room when I found it. He saw my reaction. When I questioned him, he became most uneasy. He insisted it was an indexing mistake and ordered me to replace the file. Yesterday morning I returned to inspect it again, and the volume had been removed. By afternoon I was told my services were no longer required." Holmes's eyes narrowed with satisfaction. "Excellent." Pembroke stared. "Excellent? My dear sir, nothing is more useful than an enemy who acts too soon. Your dismissal proves that your discovery was not accidental in its consequences, whatever it may have been in its origin. The cab drew up at last before a sombre house in Queen Anne Gate, its brick front looming dimly through the fog. See, a single lamp burned over the door. Holmes sprang out, and we followed. The knocker had scarcely fallen beneath my hand before the door was opened by a gaunt butler, whose face, though impassive, bore unmistakable marks of irritation at so late an intrusion. "Mr. Julius Amberley," said Holmes with the air of one announcing an expected appointment. "A matter touching his personal safety." The servant started despite himself, and that involuntary movement did not escape my companion. "You had better say," he returned stiffly, "that Mr. Holmes has called from Baker Street." We were shown into a severe drawing-room where every article seemed placed with mathematical precision. The curtains were half-drawn, the coal burned low. Oh, and the entire chamber gave that impression of barren comfort which belongs to houses ruled by habit rather than affection. Presently the master of it entered. Julius Amberley was a tall, spare man with iron-grey whiskers and a forehead bald to the crown. His face was narrow and deeply lined, but it was his eyes which most arrested me, pale, penetrating, and singularly cold, as though long practice in official reserve had dried up whatever warmer currents once moved beneath them. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I know your name. To what do I owe this disturbance?" Holmes studied him with grave courtesy. "To the possibility, Mr. Amberley, that within 3 days your life may be in danger." If our host felt surprise, he mastered it admirably. Only the fingers of his right hand closed more tightly upon the back of the chair before him.
This is an odd form of introduction. It is an odd case. Amberley's gaze shifted to Pembroke, and for the first time a change came over his expression. Not fear, but a flash of irritation swiftly suppressed. "Ah," said he, "a clerk? Government offices breed nervous imaginations." Holmes did not sit. Perhaps. Yet imaginations do not commonly produce sealed registry entries describing a murder before it occurs. For a moment, the room seemed to contract about us. Amberley's pallor deepened by a shade so slight that I might not have noticed it had I not already been watching him closely. "I have no idea what you mean," said he. "I think," Holmes replied softly, "that you have some idea." The older man moved to the hearth and extended one hand toward the fire.
Though the gesture appeared more intended to conceal its tremor than to gain warmth. "You come into my house at night," said he, "with fantastic tales and indirect accusations. If this is some practical joke—" "It is not," said Holmes. "Then explain yourself plainly." Holmes took the folded document from his pocket, but did not yet hand it over. "A record exists in Whitehall describing your death in your study at 9:15 on the evening of the 5th of December. The body is to be discovered with the window unlatched from within, and no sign of forced entry." Amberley stared at him. Then, very slowly, he sank into the chair beside the fire. "The 5th of December," he repeated. His voice had altered. The composure was still present, yet something beneath it had shifted. It's as when one hears a crack within a wall before the plaster gives way. Holmes stepped closer. "You recognize the date?" Amberley looked up sharply. "No." "You recognize it?" said Holmes, "because something is arranged for that evening." At that, the man's lips tightened. He was silent for several seconds, and when he spoke again, his words came measured and deliberate. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I begin to think that you may indeed be the very man I require. For if what you say is true, then the matter does not concern merely my safety." He leaned forward, and in the firelight I saw for the first time not coldness in his eyes, but dread. "It concerns," said Julius Amberley, "a paper which should never have left my possession." Holmes did not immediately reply. He stood with one hand resting lightly upon the back of a chair, his keen gaze fixed upon Amberley with that quiet intensity which I had so often seen unnerve even the most resolute of men. "A paper?" said he at last. "Government in nature, I presume?" Amberley gave a slight inclination of the head. "Formerly so. It passed through my hands during my tenure at the India Office. A report, classified, highly sensitive, and, I may add, quite capable of causing considerable upheaval, were its contents made public." Holmes' expression betrayed neither surprise nor alarm. "And this paper has been mislaid?" "Stolen," Amberley corrected sharply. "Removed from my private safe not 3 days ago." Holmes's eyes flickered. 3 days, he repeated softly. "An interesting coincidence, Watson." "Indeed," I murmured, though the full significance escaped me. Amberley continued, his voice tightening.
Yeah, at first I believed it to be a common burglary, though nothing else was disturbed. But now, if what you say is true, this absurd document, this prediction of my death—" "It ceases to be absurd," Holmes interjected, "and becomes instead a most deliberate communication." Pembroke shifted uneasily. "You mean someone has written that record intentionally, to warn him?" Holmes shook his head slightly. "Not to warn, to declare." Amberley rose abruptly. "Declare what?" Holmes turned toward the window, his silhouette framed against the dim light beyond. "That your death is not merely anticipated, but arranged. That an official record has already been prepared, as though the matter were concluded. It is a statement of certainty, Mr. Amberley, not prophecy, but design." A silence followed, heavy and oppressive.
Amberley moved slowly to a cabinet and withdrew a decanter. His hand was steadier now, though his face retained that strained pallor. "You suggest," said he, pouring a measure of brandy, "that someone intends not only to kill me, but to ensure that the machinery of government acknowledges the act in advance." "I suggest," said Holmes, "that we are dealing with a mind, or a group of minds, possessed of unusual audacity, and perhaps of access to official channels." Amberley handed him a glass which Holmes accepted but did not drink. "You spoke of a safe," Holmes continued. "May I see it?" Amberley hesitated only a moment before nodding. "This way." We followed him from the drawing-room into a narrow corridor, the walls lined with framed maps and documents. At its end lay a study, precisely as described in the mysterious record. Even before Holmes crossed the threshold, I felt a curious tightening in my chest, as though we had stepped into a space already marked by some unseen design. The room was austere, yet meticulously ordered. A large writing desk stood near the centre, its surface bare save for a blotter and a single pen. To the right, a tall window overlooked a small garden, now lost in fog. Against the far wall stood an iron safe, its door ajar. Holmes approached it at once. "You have not altered anything?" he asked. "Nothing," Amberley replied. "I wished to preserve the scene, though I scarcely knew for whom." Holmes crouched before the safe, examining the lock with a small lens he had produced from his pocket. His movements were precise, economical, and utterly absorbed. "No signs of forcing," he murmured. "No scratches, no distortion. The mechanism is intact." He turned his head slightly. "Who possesses the combination?" "Myself alone." Holmes rose and stepped back, his fingers tapping lightly against his chin. "And yet the paper is gone." "Yes." Holmes moved to the desk, then to the window. He examined the latch, the frame, the sill. I saw him pause for the briefest instant, his gaze fixed upon something so minute that I could not at first discern it. "Well?" I asked. "Later, Watson," said he quietly. He straightened and turned once more to Amberley. "Tell me, did anyone know of the existence of this document?" Amberley hesitated. "Not officially. It was retained under my personal discretion. However—" He stopped. "However?" Holmes prompted. "There was one man," Amberley admitted. "A colleague at the time, Mr. Lethbridge. He had access to certain summaries."
Though not the full report. Pembroke gave a small, involuntary start. Lethbridge? Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "Ah, our overzealous superior reappears." Amberley looked between them. "You know him?" "Only through Mr. Pembroke's account," said Holmes. "A man quick to dismiss inconvenient inquiries and quicker still to remove the inquirer." Amberley's expression darkened. "Lethbridge is ambitious, he always was, but this would be madness." Holmes gave a soft, almost amused exhalation. "Madness and ambition are frequent companions." He turned again toward the window. "You say nothing else was taken," he went on. "Yet the thief, having secured his prize, left the safe closed and undamaged. He entered no other room, disturbed no other object. A man of purpose, then, not a common burglar." Amberley nodded grimly.
And that was my conclusion." Holmes leaned closer to the window frame. "And this latch," said he, almost to himself. "Curious, very curious." I stepped beside him. "What do you see?" "A detail so small," Holmes replied, "that it has escaped notice, yet so telling that it may well prove the pivot upon which the entire case turns." He pointed to the inner edge of the frame. There, barely visible, was a faint smudge, no more than a thin streak, as though left by some substance lightly brushed against the wood. "Grease," I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "Not grease. Something more refined. Observe its consistency, thin yet persistent, and note its placement, precisely where the latch meets the frame." Amberley stepped forward. "What does it signify?" Holmes straightened slowly, his expression now one of quiet satisfaction. "It signifies," said he, "that the safe was not the only point of entry." A chill passed through me. "But the window was locked from within," I protested. Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, Watson, it was." He glanced once more around the study, his eyes lingering upon the desk, the safe, the window. Each element, I knew, already falling into place within that extraordinary mind. "Mr. Amberley," he said, "I must ask you one final question, for the present. On the evening of the 5th of December, where do you intend to be at 9:15? Amberley hesitated again, longer this time. "In this room," he said at last. "Alone." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Then," said he, "unless we intervene, you will be precisely where your murderer expects you to be." The words hung in the air, cold and inescapable. Outside, the fog pressed closer still against the glass, as though the very night had drawn nearer to listen. Amberley's fingers tightened upon the edge of the desk, the knuckles whitening under the strain. "You speak of it as though it were inevitable," said he, with an effort at composure. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I have no intention of sitting quietly to be murdered." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Nor would I advise it. Indeed, it is precisely because your intentions may differ from your adversary's expectations that we possess a narrow advantage." Pembroke, who had remained near the doorway, spoke in a strained voice. "Then there is a way to prevent it?" Holmes turned toward him. "There is always a way, Mr. Pembroke. The difficulty lies in discerning it before events outrun us." He moved once more about the room, to his gaze now sharpened by purpose rather than curiosity. The earlier inspection had been one of observation. This was calculation. "You say you were alone when the paper disappeared?" Holmes resumed, addressing Amberley. "No visitors, no servants admitted to this room?" "No one," said Amberley firmly. "My household is small and well regulated. My butler has served me for 15 years, and the maid does not enter the study without express instruction." Holmes nodded. "And yet the safe is opened without force, the document removed, and no trace left, save this." He indicated the faint smear upon the window frame. Amberley frowned. "You place great importance upon a mark that might have been made at any time." Holmes's eyes flashed briefly. "Nothing is made at any time, Mr. Amberley. Everything is made at a particular time, for a particular reason. The task before us is to discover both." He turned to me. "Watson, you will observe that the latch, though apparently secure, has been tampered with, not by force, but by preparation." I bent closer, examining it again. "Preparation? You mean the substance was applied to reduce friction?" "Precisely. A lubricant, likely of a fine mechanical variety. It would allow the latch to be manipulated with minimal resistance. Now consider, if one were able to access the latch from without." "But the window is on the second floor," I protested, "and the garden below. Surely no one could reach it without detection." Holmes smiled faintly. "Surely." "My dear Watson, the word returns again. Let us banish it from our vocabulary for the duration of this case." He moved to the window and opened it slightly. The fog drifted inward at once, cool and damp against the face. Holmes leaned out, peering downward. "Come here," said he. I joined him and followed the direction of his gaze. Below, the small garden lay in shadow, its outline softened by the mist. At first I saw nothing unusual, but then just beneath the window something caught my eye. "A trellis," I said, "fixed against the wall." "Just so," Holmes replied. "And recently disturbed." "Disturbed?" "Observe the lower vines, broken here and again higher up. Not enough to attract casual notice, but sufficient to bear the weight of a cautious climber." Amberley uttered a low exclamation. "You mean someone scaled the wall?" "I mean," said Holmes, "I'd that someone had both the means and the knowledge to do so without leaving obvious traces." He closed the window again and turned back into the room. "But that alone does not explain the safe," I said. "Even if the intruder entered by the window, how could he open it without the combination?" Holmes regarded me with approval. "An excellent question, and one which brings us to the heart of the matter." He faced Amberley once more. "You are certain," said he, "that no one could have observed you using the safe?" Amberley hesitated. "Certain?" Holmes repeated softly. Amberley's gaze shifted, and for the first time there was something like uncertainty in it. I took precautions," he said. "I was always careful." Holmes's expression did not change.
Careful men are often observed precisely because they believe themselves to be so." Pembroke spoke suddenly. "Mr. Lethbridge, he visited you, did he not, some months ago?" Amberley started. "Yes, but only briefly." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Ah, and during this visit, did you by chance access the safe?" Amberley was silent. Holmes took a step closer. "You did?" The older man drew himself up stiffly. "It is possible," he admitted reluctantly. "We were discussing certain matters, and I may have consulted the document." Holmes gave a small, satisfied nod. "Then the combination was observed, or at least partially inferred. A skilled man requires only fragments to reconstruct the whole." "But Lethbridge could not have done all this alone," said Pembroke. "The document, the registry entry, the dismissal—" "Quite so," Holmes agreed.
"Trait which suggests that we are not dealing with a solitary actor, but with an arrangement." He began to pace slowly across the room. "Let us consider the sequence," he continued. First, the document is removed from this safe. Next, a record is created within the registry office describing your death in precise terms. Then, when Mr. Pembroke discovers this anomaly, he is dismissed, thus eliminating an inconvenient witness. And all this, I said, before the crime itself has occurred. Holmes stopped and turned toward me. Before the crime has occurred, or before it is intended to be recognized as such. I frowned. I do not follow. Holmes's voice dropped slightly. Suppose, Watson, that the act itself is not the primary objective. Suppose the objective is the appearance of inevitability. A crime recorded in advance becomes, in a sense,
sanctioned by its own existence. It creates the illusion that events are unfolding according to some established order. You mean to say, I exclaimed, that the record is meant to legitimize the murder? Precisely. It is a most audacious inversion of cause and effect. Amberley sank heavily into his chair. But why? Why go to such lengths? Holmes regarded him steadily. Because the paper you possess, or rather possessed, is of sufficient importance to justify them. A faint tremor passed through Amberley's frame. You believe they will kill me for it, he said. I believe, Holmes replied, that they intend to ensure that you cannot interfere with whatever use they now make of it. Pembroke looked from one to the other. Then the 5th of December is not merely a date, said Holmes.
Why, it is a deadline. The room seemed colder than before. What are we to do? Amberley asked. Holmes' eyes gleamed once more with that quiet, dangerous brilliance I had come to recognize. We shall do, said he, what our adversaries do not expect. And what is that? Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. We shall allow the crime to proceed. I stared at him in astonishment. Holmes! Not in fact, he added calmly, but in appearance. If a death has been recorded, then a death must be observed. Only then will those responsible reveal their hand. Amberley rose again, agitation breaking through his restraint. You propose to use me as bait? I propose, said Holmes, to give you the only chance of surviving what has already been set in motion. He paused, and then added with quiet certainty, for we are no longer attempting to prevent a crime, Mr. Amberley. His gaze flicked briefly toward the folded document in his pocket. We are attempting to outwit one that has, in a very real sense, already been committed. I confess that Holmes's proposal struck me at first as bordering upon the reckless, if not the outright dangerous. To permit the semblance of a murder, particularly one so carefully contrived, seemed to invite disaster of the most irreversible kind. Yet I had learned, through long acquaintance, that where Holmes appeared most audacious, he was often most precise. Amberley, however, was not so easily reconciled. You speak of appearances, said he, his voice taut with restrained alarm. But I see only the very real prospect of my death, or I will not sit here while some unseen enemy carries out his design merely to satisfy an intellectual curiosity. Holmes regarded him with grave patience. You mistake me, sir. I have no interest in intellectual curiosities when a life is at stake, least of all yours, which, for the moment, is essential to my inquiry. What I propose is not passivity, but control. Amberley's expression did not soften. Explain yourself. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back and began to pace slowly before the hearth. The strength of our adversary's position, he said, lies in his certainty. He has arranged his elements, the theft, the record, the date, the location, into a fixed pattern. He believes that pattern to be immutable. If we were to act openly, summon the police, alter your habits, I'd remove you from the house. We should only alert him and drive him to adapt. In such a contest, He may well hold the advantage. And your alternative? Holmes stopped and turned. My alternative is to convince him that nothing has changed, that events proceed precisely as he has foreseen them. Pembroke leaned forward. But if he believes that, then he will go through with it. Exactly, said Holmes. I could not contain myself. Holmes, you cannot mean to allow the attempt to be made without intervention. Holmes smiled faintly. On the contrary, Watson, I mean to intervene at the only moment that matters. He turned again to Amberley. You will remain here on the evening of the 5th. You will occupy this room at the appointed hour, exactly as the record describes. You will behave as you ordinarily would, no deviation, no sign of apprehension. Amberley gave a short, incredulous laugh. And I suppose you expect me to sit quietly at my desk while a murderer climbs through my window? I expect, Holmes replied evenly, that you will do precisely as I instruct, because your life depends upon it. There was a firmness in his tone that silenced further protest. You will not be alone, Holmes continued. Watson and I will be present. Though not in a manner visible to your visitor, the police too will be informed, but only at the final stage, when their intervention can be decisive rather than disruptive. Amberley hesitated, his gaze shifting between Holmes and myself. And until then? Until then, said Holmes, we prepare. He moved once more to the window, examining the latch with renewed attention.
Our intruder has already demonstrated his method of entry, he went on. He will come again by the same means. There is no reason for him to alter what has succeeded once. The trellis provides access, the lubricated latch allows silent entry, and the fog, should it persist, will conceal his approach. And if it does not persist? I asked. Holmes' eyes glinted. Then we must rely upon less accommodating forms of concealment. Pembroke rose uneasily. Mr. Holmes, there is something else. Holmes turned toward him. Yes? The document, the registry entry, it did not merely describe the murder. It also noted that no suspect had been apprehended. Holmes' expression sharpened at once. Indeed? Yes. It stated that the investigation was ongoing, but that no clear perpetrator had been identified. Holmes was silent for several moments.
Curious, he murmured. Very curious. Why so? I asked. Because, said Holmes, if our adversary has gone to such lengths to construct this elaborate narrative, it would be natural for him to ensure its conclusion, namely, his own escape. Yet the document leaves the matter unresolved. It suggests uncertainty. Amberley frowned. What does that imply? Holmes' gaze drifted briefly to the safe, then back to the window. It implies, he said slowly, that the writer of the document does not possess complete knowledge of what is to occur. He anticipates the crime, but not its aftermath. Pembroke's brow furrowed. Then the record is not a certainty. Holmes shook his head. It is a projection, an intention, a carefully constructed expectation of how events should unfold. And we intend to disrupt that expectation, I said. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Precisely. He stepped closer to Amberley. Tell me, he said, on the evening in question, what is your usual habit? Amberley seemed momentarily taken aback by the mundanity of the question. I dine at 7, he said. Afterward, I retire to this room. I review correspondence, attend to accounts, and occasionally read until 9:30 or 10. You receive no visitors? None? Holmes nodded. And your servants? The butler retires to his quarters by 9. The maid earlier still. Holmes's lips curved faintly. Then our stage is set with admirable simplicity. He turned to me. Watson, You will accompany me tomorrow morning to Whitehall. There are matters concerning this registry entry which must be examined at their source. Mr. Pembroke, and you will join us. You may yet prove indispensable. Pembroke straightened slightly. I shall be ready. Holmes then addressed Amberley once more. In the meantime, you will speak of this to no one. You will alter nothing within this room. You will behave as though no such danger exists. Amberley's face remained grave, but there was now a flicker of reluctant resolve within it. And if your plan fails? He asked quietly. Holmes met his gaze without hesitation. It will not fail, said he. There was no bravado in his voice, only that calm, unwavering certainty which had so often preceded his greatest triumphs. Yet as we took our leave and stepped once more into the fog-laden street, I could not entirely dispel a sense of unease. The case, from its very inception, defied not only logic, but sequence itself. And we were no longer merely pursuing a criminal, we were contending with a design that sought to dictate the future. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated rather than troubled. As our cab bore us back toward Baker Street, he leaned forward, his eyes alight. The key, Watson, he said, lies not in what has been done, but in what has been assumed. And what is that? That the future, he replied softly, belongs to the man who writes it first. He settled back, a faint smile playing upon his lips. We shall see, said Sherlock Holmes, whether that assumption holds. Holmes spoke little more that night, though I could perceive, from the occasional tightening of his features and the restless tapping of his long fingers upon the arm of the cab, that his mind was engaged in one of those rapid and complex processes which no interruption could profitably assist. Upon our return to Baker Street, he declined both supper and conversation, and instead withdrew to his chemical table, where he remained for nearly 2 hours amidst a clutter of reagents, lenses, and curious apparatus. It was close upon midnight when he at last joined me again in the sitting-room. I had been attempting to read, though with little success, for my thoughts were still occupied with the strange and ominous affair we had just left behind. "You are troubled, Watson," said he, seating himself opposite me. "I confess it," I replied.
Neatly, the case appears to invert the very order of reason. We are asked to prevent a crime which has already been recorded as accomplished. It is, disquieting. Holmes steepled his fingers. It is precisely because it appears disquieting that it has been constructed so. Our adversary relies not merely upon action, but upon psychological effect. You believe, then, that the document was intended to intimidate? Not intimidate, condition, said Holmes. It establishes a framework within which all subsequent events are interpreted. Once a man believes his fate is sealed, he begins unconsciously to conform to it. Amberley did not appear a man easily cowed. No, Holmes admitted, but even the strongest minds are susceptible when confronted with apparent inevitability. That is why the document exists, not merely to record,
Always but to guide. I considered this in silence. "And Lethbridge?" I asked at last. "You place great weight upon his involvement." Holmes rose and crossed to the mantel, where he lit his pipe with deliberate care. "I place weight upon his opportunity," said he, "access to registry records, knowledge of Amberley's possession of the document, and, most tellingly, a motive suggested by his behaviour toward Mr. Pembroke." "You mean his dismissal?" "Precisely. A guilty man may conceal, evade, or deny, but he rarely refrains from eliminating an inconvenient witness when the chance presents itself." Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke, watching it curl upward into the lamplight. "Yet," he continued, "there remains a difficulty." "What is that?" If Lethbridge, or whoever stands behind him, has arranged this elaborate sequence, why risk so much upon a single act of murder? The theft of the document was already accomplished. Why not simply retain it and remain undiscovered? Unless, I suggested, Amberley himself poses some continuing threat. Holmes turned slightly, his eyes narrowing in approval. Just so, Watson. That is the question which must be answered. What does Amberley know, or what can he do that necessitates his removal? Before I could respond, Holmes moved abruptly to the table and took up the folded registry document once more. "Let us return to the text," said he. "We must assume that every element within it has been selected with purpose." He smoothed it out and pointed to a line near the conclusion. "Here," he said, "no signs of forced entry, window unlatched from within." That detail is not merely descriptive, it is explanatory. It directs the observer toward a particular interpretation, that the crime was committed by someone already inside the house or by some means not immediately apparent. "You mean it is designed to mislead the investigation?" "Exactly. It creates the illusion of an impossible crime, one that diverts attention from the true method." I leaned forward. "But we have already seen that the window was used." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, but not in the manner suggested. The document implies that the window is a mystery. In truth, it is a solution, one we have already uncovered." He folded the paper again and slipped it back into his pocket. "There is also the matter of timing," he continued. 9:15, a precise hour, not too early, when servants might still be active, nor too late, when suspicion might be aroused by irregular habits. It is a time chosen for maximum predictability. And Amberley himself confirms that he will be here, alone, at that hour. Indeed. Holmes fell silent for a moment, then spoke again with renewed intensity. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall examine the registry office itself. I wish to know who had access to that entry, how it was inserted, and whether any trace remains of its origin. Mr. Pembroke's testimony will be of value, but I prefer to see with my own eyes. And if Lethbridge is involved, then we shall observe him carefully, and without alerting him to our suspicions." Holmes paused, then added thoughtfully, "It is possible that he is but one part of a larger arrangement." "You suspect others?" "I suspect necessity," said Holmes. "A scheme of this complexity rarely rests upon a single mind." The following morning broke grey and cold, the fog having lifted somewhat, but leaving behind a damp chill that penetrated even the heaviest coat. Holmes was already dressed and waiting when I entered the sitting-room, his manner brisk and purposeful. "Come, Watson," said he. "Time is of the essence." We found Pembroke awaiting us at the appointed place near Whitehall, his expression anxious but resolute. Together we made our way to the registry office, a solemn building whose ordered facade seemed, under the circumstances, to conceal more than it revealed. As we entered, I could not help but feel that we were stepping into the very mechanism by which this strange affair had been set in motion. Holmes paused just inside the doorway, his eyes moving swiftly over the interior, the clerks at their desks, the shelves of bound volumes, the quiet hum of bureaucratic activity. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "A place devoted to recording what has been, and yet, in this instance, it has dared to record what will be." Pembroke led us toward a side corridor. "This way," said he quietly. "The archive room lies beyond." We had gone but a few steps when a figure emerged from an adjoining office, a tall man with sharp features and a narrow, calculating gaze. Pembroke stiffened at once. "That is he," he whispered. "Mr. Lethbridge." Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the slight tightening of his lips which signalled heightened interest. "Then," said he softly, "we shall begin at the centre." Lethbridge's eyes fell upon us, and in that instant I perceived a flicker, so brief that another might have missed it, of recognition, followed by something colder still, not surprise, but expectation. Holmes advanced without hesitation, to his manner that of a man engaged upon the most ordinary of inquiries, though I knew well that every word and gesture was calculated to the finest degree. "Mr. Lethbridge, I presume," said he, inclining his head slightly. The man regarded him coolly. Up close his features appeared even more severe than at a distance, thin lips, a prominent nose, and eyes that seemed perpetually to weigh and measure whatever lay before them. "I am Mr. Lethbridge," he replied. "And you are—" "Sherlock Holmes." If the name produced any effect, it was expertly concealed. Lethbridge's expression did not alter, though I fancied there was a fractional pause before he spoke again. "Indeed, I have heard of you. To what do I owe this visit?" Holmes gestured lightly toward Pembroke. "A matter arising from a former clerk in your department, Mr. Pembroke has drawn my attention to an irregularity in your records, one of sufficient interest to warrant my personal inspection." Lethbridge's gaze flicked briefly toward Pembroke, and in that glance I detected unmistakable hostility. "Mr. Pembroke," said he, "was dismissed for incompetence." Pembroke flushed, but Holmes intervened before he could respond. "Quite possibly," said Holmes, "yet incompetence, like genius, occasionally stumbles upon the truth." A faint tightening of Lethbridge's jaw betrayed his irritation. "I do not conduct official business in corridors," he said. "If you have a legitimate inquiry, you may submit it in writing." Holmes smiled pleasantly. "Ah, but that would defeat the purpose. You see, I am less interested in official channels than in unofficial ones." There was a moment's silence, and then Lethbridge turned on his heel. "Very well," said he curtly. "You may accompany me." He led us down the corridor and into a private office, a narrow, well-ordered room containing a desk, several cabinets, and a tall shelf of bound volumes. He closed the door behind us with deliberate care. "Now," said he, taking his seat, "state your business." Holmes remained standing. "A registry entry," said he, "dated 3 days hence, describing the death of one Mr. Julius Amberley." Lethbridge's eyes rested upon him without flinching. "I am not aware of any such entry." Holmes inclined his head. "That is unfortunate, for it was present in your archives until quite recently. Mr. Pembroke here discovered it, and shortly thereafter found himself relieved of his duties." Lethbridge folded his hands upon the desk.
"Or coincidence?" "Perhaps," said Holmes. "Yet I have always found coincidence to be the least satisfactory of explanations." Lethbridge's gaze hardened. "If you have come to accuse me—" I have come," Holmes interrupted calmly, "to understand." The two men regarded one another in silence. It was a contest of wills, subtle yet unmistakable, and I could not doubt that each was acutely aware of the other's capabilities. At length Lethbridge spoke again. "You claim that a record exists of a crime that has not yet occurred," said he. "Do you seriously expect me to entertain such nonsense?" Holmes's voice remained even. "I expect you to recognize that such a record did exist and that it was removed." Lethbridge leaned back slightly. "Records are created and withdrawn constantly. Errors are corrected, misfiles are rectified."
"Oh, that is the nature of administration." "Indeed," said Holmes. "And yet this particular error was of a most imaginative kind." Lethbridge gave a thin smile. "Then perhaps it originated in an imaginative mind." Holmes' eyes flickered briefly toward the shelves behind him. "Yes," said he softly. "Perhaps it did." He stepped past the desk and moved toward the cabinets, examining their labels with casual interest. "You will forgive me," said Lethbridge sharply, "if I object to your handling official documents?" Holmes did not turn. "You will forgive me," he replied, "if I persist." There was a quiet authority in his tone which for a moment seemed to check even Lethbridge's opposition. Holmes ran his fingers lightly along the spines of the volumes, then paused. "Curious," he murmured. "What is curious?" I asked. "This section," said Holmes, indicating a gap between two volumes. "The sequence is interrupted. The numbering suggests that a volume is missing." Lethbridge rose at once. "That is a routine matter. Volumes are removed for reference." Holmes turned slowly. "Of course," said he. "And I suppose this particular volume was removed at precisely the moment when Mr. Pembroke discovered its contents." Lethbridge's lips thinned. "You draw unwarranted conclusions." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "On the contrary," said he, "I draw the only conclusions available. A document appears describing a future crime. It is discovered by a clerk, who is promptly dismissed. The volume containing the document is then removed, and you, Mr. Lethbridge, profess ignorance of the entire affair." He took a step closer. "It is a pattern," Holmes continued quietly. "And patterns, once recognized, are exceedingly difficult to conceal." Lethbridge held his ground, though I could see a faint flush rising along his cheekbones. "You are treading on dangerous ground, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled faintly. "I find that ground is most dangerous when one does not know where one stands." For a moment it seemed as though Lethbridge might respond with open anger, but instead he mastered himself with visible effort. "You have no proof," he said. Holmes inclined his head. "Not yet." The admission appeared to restore some measure of confidence to Lethbridge. "Then I suggest," said he coldly, "that you conclude your visit." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then turned away. "As you wish," said he. We moved toward the door, Pembroke casting one last uneasy glance over his shoulder. As Holmes reached the threshold, however, he paused. "One final question, Mr. Lethbridge," said he. The man did not reply, but his eyes remained fixed upon Holmes. "On the evening of the 5th of December," Holmes continued, "where do you intend to be?" There was the slightest hesitation, so slight that another might have missed it. "In my own residence," said Lethbridge at last. "Where else?" Holmes inclined his head once more. "Of course." We stepped out into the corridor, and the door closed softly behind us. Pembroke exhaled sharply. "You saw it, did you not? He knows. He must know." Holmes did not answer at once. He walked several paces in silence, his expression thoughtful. "Yes," he said at last. "He knows something." "And is he the man behind it?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "No," said he. "He's not the architect." Pembroke stared. "But—" "He is too cautious," Holmes continued. "I too controlled. A man like Lethbridge does not construct elaborate schemes, he executes them." I felt a chill at his words. "Then there is someone else," I said. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Yes," said he softly. "Someone who writes the future and expects others to follow it." He glanced back once toward the closed office door. "And I begin to suspect," he added, "that Mr. Lethbridge fears that man far more than he fears me." Holmes maintained his silence until we had quitted the building and regained the street, where the grey light of the late morning lent a stark clarity to the movements of clerks and officials passing to and fro. Only, when we had turned into a quieter thoroughfare, did he slacken his pace and glance back to ensure we were not observed. "You are disappointed, Watson?" said he. "I confess I am somewhat at a loss," I replied. Lethbridge's manner was guarded, certainly, but I had expected something more decisive. If he is not the principal actor, then we are no nearer to identifying who is. Holmes's lips curved faintly. "On the contrary, we are considerably nearer." Pembroke, who had followed us in evident agitation, spoke quickly. "You mean he betrayed something?" "He betrayed a great deal," said Holmes, "though not in the manner you anticipate. It is not what a man says under scrutiny that reveals him, but what he avoids." "And what did Lethbridge avoid?" I asked. Holmes slowed his stride, as though to better marshal his thoughts. "He did not deny the existence of the document," said he. "He denied knowledge of it. That is a subtle but significant distinction. A man confronted with an impossibility will reject it outright. Lethbridge merely distanced himself from it." "Then he has seen it," said Pembroke eagerly. "Undoubtedly. More than that, he has handled it, and very likely assisted in its placement." "Then why not confront him directly?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Because he's not the mind we seek. He is an intermediary, useful, informed, and cautious, but ultimately subordinate." Pembroke looked troubled. "You said he fears someone." "Yes," Holmes replied quietly. "And fear, when genuine, is rarely misplaced." We walked on in silence for several moments before Holmes spoke again. "There is another point," said he. "Did you observe his reaction when I mentioned the 5th of December?" "I saw nothing unusual," I admitted. "Precisely," said Holmes. "And that is what makes it unusual. A man falsely accused may react with indignation. A guilty man with deflection, but a man who hears a detail already known to him, yet dangerous to acknowledge, will strive for absolute neutrality." "And Lethbridge did just that," I said slowly. "Indeed. Which tells us that the date is not merely significant, it is fixed." Pembroke's brow furrowed. "Then the plan cannot be altered?" Holmes smiled slightly. "Oh, it can be altered, but our adversary believes it will not be." He paused, then added, "And that belief is the fulcrum upon which we shall act." We had by then reached the Strand, where the bustle of London life surged around us in ceaseless motion. Holmes hailed a cab, and we climbed in, Pembroke still visibly unsettled. "To Baker Street," said Holmes. As the cab rattled forward, I turned once more to my companion. "You spoke earlier," I said. "And of someone who writes the future. Do you mean that literally?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. "Not literally, Watson, though the effect is much the same. Consider, a document is created describing an event. That document is placed within an official archive, lending it authority. Those who encounter it are influenced consciously or unconsciously by its contents. In this way, the future is not predicted, but constructed. You suggest that the crime is being shaped to match the record?" "Exactly. The record is the blueprint. The crime is the execution." Pembroke shivered. "But who would conceive of such a thing?" Holmes leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "A man," said he, "who understands not only systems but minds, a man who recognizes that if one can control the narrative of an event, one may control the event itself." "And Amberley's document?" I asked. "Where does it fit into this?" Holmes's gaze grew more intent. "That," said he, "is the question which now assumes paramount importance. We must determine why that particular paper was worth stealing, and why its theft necessitates Amberley's death." The cab drew up before Baker Street, and we alighted. Holmes dismissed the driver and led the way upstairs without another word. Once inside, he removed his coat and moved directly to the writing desk, where he began to sort through a collection of papers with brisk efficiency. "Watson," said he, "you will oblige me by recalling everything Amberley told us regarding the document.
Spare no detail, however trivial it may seem. I seated myself and did as he requested.
To recounting Amberley's description of the report, its origin in the India office, its sensitive nature, its potential to cause upheaval if revealed. Holmes listened intently, occasionally jotting down a note or pausing to consider some point more closely. At no time, he said at last, did he specify its contents in precise terms. No, I replied, only that it was of great importance. Holmes tapped his pen lightly against the desk. A curious omission, said he. A man fearing for his life would ordinarily be eager to disclose any information that might assist in his protection. Yet Amberley withheld the very substance of the matter. You think he is concealing something? I am certain of it. Pembroke, who had been standing near the window, turned abruptly. Then he cannot be trusted. Holmes raised a hand. And on the contrary, he can be trusted to act in accordance with his own interests. The difficulty lies in determining what those interests truly are. He rose and crossed to the fireplace, his expression now one of deep concentration. There is a connection here, he murmured, between the stolen document, the registry entry, and the planned murder. They are not separate events, but components of a single design. He turned suddenly toward me. Watson, what is the one element common to all three? I considered for a moment, then shook my head. I cannot say. Holmes's eyes flashed. Information, said he. The document contains information, the registry entry manipulates information, and the murder, if successful, will prevent information from being revealed. Pembroke stared at him.
Then the entire scheme is about controlling knowledge. Precisely. Holmes's voice grew quieter. And that tells us something most important about our adversary. What is that? I asked. That he does not merely seek to act, Holmes replied. He seeks to define reality. A silence fell upon the room. Holmes moved to the window and gazed out over Baker Street, his figure framed against the pale daylight. Such a man, he continued softly, will not rely upon chance. Every step will be calculated, every outcome anticipated. He will believe himself beyond error. Holmes turned back to us, his eyes alight with that singular brilliance which heralded his most decisive insights. And it is precisely there, said he, that we shall find his weakness. Holmes' words lingered in the air long after he had spoken them.
And I could not help but feel that we stood upon the brink of some vast and intricate design, the full outline of which had not yet revealed itself even to him. And how, I asked at length, does one exploit the weakness of a man who calculates everything? Holmes turned from the window, his expression sharpened by quiet resolve. By introducing that which he has not calculated, said he. Not randomness, Watson, he would account for that, but contradiction, a fact that cannot be reconciled with his design. Pembroke shook his head uneasily. But if he has planned everything so carefully, then he has committed himself to a single version of events, Holmes interrupted, and any deviation from that version will force him to act, to correct, to adjust, to reveal himself. Holmes crossed to the table and took up a sheet of paper. Our task, therefore, he continued, is to construct such a deviation, subtle enough to pass unnoticed at first, yet decisive enough to compel intervention. And this must occur on the evening of the 5th, I said. Precisely. He began to write rapidly, his pen moving with that swift decisiveness which always marked the culmination of his reasoning. There is, however, he added, one matter which must be resolved before we proceed further. And that is? I asked. Holmes looked up. The true nature of Amberley's document. Pembroke frowned. but he refused to describe it in detail. "Which," said Holmes, "renders it all the more essential that we discover what he has withheld." He folded the paper he had been writing upon and handed it to me. "A note for Inspector Lestrade," said he. "You will deliver it personally, Watson. Discretion is of the utmost importance." I glanced at the message, which was brief but unmistakably urgent. "You intend to involve the police after all?" "At the appropriate moment," Holmes replied. Lestrade is reliable when properly directed, though one must occasionally compensate for his enthusiasm. Pembroke shifted uneasily. "And what am I to do?" Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "You will return to your usual routine," said he. "Make no attempt to contact anyone connected with the registry office. If Lethbridge or his associates suspect that you have spoken further of the matter, they may act prematurely." Pembroke swallowed. "You think I'm in danger?" Holmes' expression softened slightly. "I think," said he, "that you are inconvenient, and in this affair inconvenience has already proven hazardous." The man nodded reluctantly. "I understand." Holmes inclined his head. "Good. Then we shall reconvene tomorrow evening." Pembroke took his leave shortly thereafter, his steps hesitant as he descended the stairs. I, too, prepared to depart for Scotland Yard, but as I reached the door, Holmes's voice recalled me. "One moment, Watson." I turned. "There is something I wish you to consider while you are out," said he. "A question, simple in form yet central to the entire case." "Well?" Holmes's gaze fixed upon me with quiet intensity. "If a man wished to convince the world that a crime had already occurred, what would he require?" I reflected for a moment. "A record?" I said. "Witnesses, perhaps. Evidence." Holmes nodded slightly. "Yes, but more than that, he would require authority, and the endorsement of a system that is not easily questioned." "You mean the registry office?" "Exactly, and that brings us to a most interesting point." He leaned forward slightly. "The record we saw was not merely placed within the archives, it was formatted, indexed, and sealed as though it had passed through the proper channels. That implies cooperation, whether willing or coerced, at multiple levels. Then the conspiracy extends beyond Lethbridge?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I have no doubt of it." I set off at once for Scotland Yard, my mind occupied with his words. The meeting with Lestrade was brief but effective. The inspector, though initially sceptical, was soon persuaded by the gravity of the matter and agreed to act upon Holmes's instructions when the time came. It was late afternoon when I returned to Baker Street. Holmes was seated in his armchair, his violin resting across his lap, though he was not playing. His eyes were closed, and for a moment I believed him asleep. But as I entered, he spoke without opening them. "You have seen Lestrade?" "Yes, he will be ready." "Good." Holmes opened his eyes and sat forward. "Then we must now address the final uncertainty." "And that is?" Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace where he stood, with his back to the light. "Amberley," said he. I stared at him. "You suspect him?" "I do not yet accuse him," Holmes replied. "But I question him." "In what way?" Holmes turned, his expression grave. "He has told us enough to engage our assistance, but not enough to secure our trust. He admits to possessing a document of great importance, yet refuses to disclose its contents. He claims to be the victim of a theft, yet offers no clear explanation of why that theft should lead to his death. You believe he knows more than he has said? I am certain of it." Holmes walked slowly across the room. "Consider this, Watson. If the document were merely valuable, it might be stolen. If it were dangerous, it might be suppressed. But to construct an entire sequence of events culminating in a recorded murder suggests something more. What could be more than that?" Holmes stopped and faced me. Something that cannot be allowed to exist. A chill passed through me. I mean, said Holmes quietly, that the document itself may be the true anomaly in this case, not the registry entry, not the planned murder, but the paper which has set all of this in motion. He paused, then added, and until we understand what that paper contains—
We are not investigating the crime, we are merely circling it. I took a step closer. Then what do you propose? Holmes's eyes shone with sudden decision. We return to Amberley, said he. Tonight? Tonight! He reached for his coat. For I suspect, Holmes continued, that if we do not compel him to speak now, before the 5th arrives, we may find that the truth, like the future itself, has already been decided without us. We set out at once, the urgency of Holmes's tone admitting no delay. The evening had drawn in swiftly, and with it came once more that heavy London fog which seemed in this singular case less a natural occurrence than a persistent accomplice. The lamps burned dimly through the haze, and the sound of our cab wheels upon the dampened streets carried a muffled, hollow quality.
Holmes remained silent throughout the journey, his head slightly bowed, his fingers pressed together in that characteristic pose which signalled intense mental activity. I did not disturb him. There was, I felt, a narrowing of the case, a drawing together of its scattered threads into some central knot which he alone could yet perceive. When at last we reached Queen Anne Gate, the house loomed before us in shadow, its windows faintly aglow. Holmes dismissed the cab at once. "No announcement this time, Watson," said he quietly. "We must observe before we are observed." We approached the house on foot, our steps softened by the damp pavement. Holmes did not go directly to the door, but instead moved along the side of the property, his gaze fixed upon the garden below Amberley's study window. "Stay here," he murmured, and he slipped through the small gate and vanished into the gloom. I waited, my senses strained, until he returned some minutes later. "Well?" I whispered. "As I suspected," said he. "The trellis has been used again, recently." "Again?" I exclaimed under my breath. "But the crime has not yet—" Holmes raised a hand. "Precisely. Which means that our adversary is not merely preparing, he is rehearsing." A chill ran through me. "You mean he has already entered the house once more?" "At least once," said Holmes. "Possibly more. And that suggests a degree of confidence which borders upon certainty." We made our way then to the front entrance, and Holmes rang the bell. Amberley himself admitted us. His appearance was altered since our last visit. Though still composed, there was now a visible strain about his eyes, and his movements bore the stiffness of a man under continual tension. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I had not expected you again so soon." "No doubt," Holmes replied, "and yet necessity often disregards expectation." Amberley hesitated, then stepped aside to admit us. "You have discovered something?" "Yes," said Holmes simply. "But first, I require the truth." Amberley's expression hardened slightly. "I have told you all that is relevant." Holmes stepped past him into the study without waiting for further invitation. "No," said he quietly. "You have told me all that is convenient." Amberley closed the door behind us. "I do not appreciate insinuations, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned sharply. "Then you will appreciate facts even less," said he. There was a sudden steel in his tone which I had seldom heard, and it had its effect. Amberley drew himself up, but did not speak. Holmes continued. "You possess, or possessed, a document of such importance that its theft has set in motion an elaborate scheme involving falsified records, manipulated evidence, and a planned murder. Yet you refuse to disclose its contents. Why?" Amberley's lips tightened. Because it is not your concern. It is entirely my concern, Holmes replied, when it places your life, and potentially others, at risk. Amberley remained silent. Holmes took a step closer. You have been entered upon more than once, said he. Your adversary has rehearsed his approach. He grows confident, and still you withhold the one piece of information that might allow us to anticipate his next move. Amberley's composure faltered. I cannot, he said. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Cannot, or will not. Amberley turned away, moving toward the fireplace. You do not understand, he said, his voice lower now. The document, if its contents were known, would not merely endanger me, it would compromise matters of far greater consequence. Holmes' expression did not soften. Then you must decide, said he, whether you prefer compromise or death. The words fell with quiet finality. For several moments, Amberley stood motionless, his back to us. Then slowly he spoke. It concerns a report, he said, one that was never intended for public record. It details certain financial transactions, irregularities, connected to colonial administration. Holmes said nothing. These transactions, Amberley continued, involve funds diverted from official channels. The sums are considerable, the names more so. Names? I repeated. Amberley turned, his face pale.
Men of influence, said he, men whose reputations and positions would not survive such exposure. Holmes's gaze sharpened. And this report came into your possession how? I compiled it, Amberley admitted. In the course of my duties, I retained a copy unofficially. For what purpose? Amberley hesitated. As insurance? Holmes gave a slight nod. Against those very men. Yes. And now, Holmes said quietly, one or more of those men seeks to recover the document and eliminate you in the process. Amberley sank into his chair. Yes. A silence followed. And Lethbridge? I asked. Amberley shook his head. He's not among them, but he is aware of the report's existence. He may have been persuaded, or compelled, to assist. Holmes turned slightly, his expression thoughtful. Then our adversary is a man of influence, said he.
I need a man with access to official systems, capable of orchestrating both the theft and the falsification of records. And of arranging my death, Amberley added bitterly. Holmes's eyes flicked briefly toward the window. Yes, said he, but not, I think, in the manner he has described. Amberley looked up sharply. What do you mean? Holmes stepped closer to the desk. The registry entry, he said, is not merely a record, it is a script. It dictates the circumstances of your death. But as with all scripts, it assumes that the actors will perform their parts exactly as written. And you intend to alter that performance, I said. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. He turned once more to Amberley. You have now told me what I needed to know. In return, I shall tell you this. Your adversary has already begun to move. He has entered this house again, perhaps more than once. He is preparing for the fifth. Amberley's face drained of colour. Then we have no time. Holmes's eyes gleamed. On the contrary, said he softly, we have exactly the amount of time he believes we have. He moved toward the window and looked out into the fog. And tomorrow night, he added, we shall see whether the future he has written is as inevitable as he imagines. The following day passed with a curious stillness, as though London itself held its breath in anticipation of the appointed hour. Holmes remained largely silent, though I observed that his inactivity was but a surface illusion. He wrote several notes, dispatched messages by hand, and spent no small portion of the afternoon in quiet contemplation, his gaze fixed upon nothing, yet clearly perceiving everything. Or as for myself, I found the hours intolerably long. The knowledge that we stood upon the threshold of an event already described, already, in some sense, recorded, lent to every passing minute a peculiar weight. It was shortly after 7 o'clock when we set out once more for Queen Anne Gate. The fog had returned in full measure, thicker even than before, coiling through the streets and clinging to the gaslight in dense, luminous folds. Holmes appeared satisfied by this. "Our adversary will find comfort in such conditions," said he. "And comfort breeds confidence." Amberley received us with a composure that I could not but admire, though I suspected it was maintained at considerable effort. His manner was precise, his movements controlled, yet beneath it all lay a tension as taut as any drawn wire. "Everything is as you instructed," said he. "The servants have retired. No alterations have been made." "Excellent," Holmes replied. "Then we shall proceed." He moved at once to the study, where he conducted a final inspection with swift efficiency. The window, the latch, the desk, the safe, each was examined and, where necessary, subtly adjusted in a manner which I could not fully discern, though I trusted implicitly in its purpose. At last he turned to Amberley. "You will sit here," said he, indicating the chair at the desk. "You will occupy yourself as usual. You will not approach the window, nor react to any sound unless I give the signal." Amberley inclined his head. "And you?" he asked. Holmes's lips curved faintly. "I shall be nearer than your visitor expects." He then drew me aside. "Watson," he said quietly, "you will take position behind the screen there."
And you will have a clear view of the window and the desk. Your revolver?" "Ready," I replied. "Good. You will not act unless I do so first. Timing is everything." "And you?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I shall be outside." "Outside?" I exclaimed softly. "Holmes, that is madness. If the man comes armed—" "All the better that he should not expect opposition from without," Holmes replied calmly. "Remember, the script he follows places the danger within this room. I intend to place the solution beyond it." There was no time for further protest. Holmes slipped silently from the room, and I took my position as instructed. Amberley seated himself at the desk, opened a ledger, and began to turn its pages with an appearance of deliberate normalcy. The clock upon the mantel ticked steadily. 8 o'clock passed, then past.
And the house lay in utter stillness, broken only by the faint rustle of paper and the distant murmur of the city beyond the fog. My senses were strained to their utmost, every nerve alert to the slightest disturbance. At 9:15, the clock gave a soft chime, and in that same instant there came a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible movement at the window. The latch shifted. Slowly, silently, the window began to open. Amberley did not move. I held my breath. A shadow appeared against the fog beyond the glass, a darker shape within the darkness. Then, with careful precision, a gloved hand reached inward, followed by the outline of a figure slipping into the room. He moved with extraordinary control, his steps soundless upon the carpet. His face was obscured, one of his features indistinct, but there was in his bearing a confidence that spoke of long preparation. He advanced toward the desk. Amberley remained seated, his back partially turned, as though unaware. The intruder drew closer. Then, from the darkness beyond the window, a voice rang out, clear, sharp, and unmistakable. "I think, sir," said Sherlock Holmes, "that you will find the conclusion of your narrative somewhat altered." The intruder started violently, turning toward the window. In that instant I saw his face, and I knew him. "Lethbridge!" I cried. The man's expression, so carefully composed before, was now transformed, no longer cold and controlled, but startled, even alarmed. Holmes appeared at the window, his figure emerging from the fog like some avenging presence. "Pray do not attempt to escape," said he calmly. The garden below is not so accommodating as you found it previously, and you will discover that you are no longer unobserved." Lethbridge's gaze darted about the room, calculating, seeking some avenue of retreat. "You are mistaken," he said sharply. "I came here to fulfill a role already written for you," Holmes interrupted. "A role which, I regret to inform you, has been revised." At that moment, the door behind us burst open, and Lestrade entered with 2 constables at his heels. "Just in time, Mr. Holmes," said he. Lethbridge stood frozen, his composure shattered. "This is absurd," he said. "You have no evidence." Holmes stepped into the room, his eyes fixed upon him. "On the contrary," said he quietly, "we have something far more valuable than evidence." "And what is that?" Lethbridge demanded. Holmes' expression was one of quiet triumph. "We have your deviation," said he. A silence fell. "The script you followed," Holmes continued, "placed the crime within this room, unseen, inexplicable, and complete. But you did not anticipate interference from without. You did not anticipate that your entry would be observed, your movements recorded, and your presence here at this precise hour confirmed." Lethbridge's face had grown pale. "You cannot prove—" "I can prove," Holmes said, "that you possessed knowledge of the planned event, that you participated in the falsification of official records, and that you entered this house with intent unknown, but highly suggestive." Lestrade stepped forward. "I think that will suffice for now," said he. The constables moved to secure their prisoner. As Lethbridge was led away, his composure returned in part, but there was now something else in his eyes. Not defiance. Fear. Holmes watched him go, his expression thoughtful rather than satisfied. "You see, Watson," said he softly, "we have not yet caught the man who writes the future." He turned back toward the window where the fog still pressed against the glass. "We have merely caught the man who follows it." Holmes remained by the window for several moments after Lethbridge had been taken away, his tall figure motionless against the pale glow of the fog beyond. There was no trace of triumph in his expression, only that quiet, inward focus which I had come to recognize as the prelude to his final synthesis of a case. Lestrade, meanwhile, rubbed his hands with evident satisfaction. "A neat capture, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Caught in the very act, and I dare say the magistrate will have little difficulty with this one." Holmes turned slowly. "I should advise caution, Inspector," said he. "Mr. Lethbridge is a participant, but not the originator. If you rest your case upon him alone, you will find it incomplete." Lestrade frowned. "Incomplete? The man was found entering the house by stealth at the very hour described in that extraordinary record." "Precisely," Holmes interrupted. "Described, not devised." Amberley rose from his chair, his composure now giving way to a palpable anxiety. "You mean to say this is not the end of it?" he asked. Holmes regarded him steadily. "I mean to say," he replied, "that the most dangerous mind in this affair has not yet revealed itself, and will not do so unless compelled." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "Well, if there's another—"
"We'll have him soon enough. Lethbridge will talk." Holmes shook his head slightly. "He will say nothing of consequence. He fears his employer more than he fears the law." At this a shadow passed across Amberley's face. "Then what is to be done?" he said. Holmes moved to the desk and placed both hands upon it, leaning forward slightly. "We must return," said he, "to the beginning. The beginning? I echoed. Holmes inclined his head. The document, said he. The report you compiled, Mr. Amberley. The information it contains is the true motive behind every action we have observed. Until we identify who stands to gain or to lose from its exposure, we shall remain one step behind. Amberley hesitated. I have told you what it contains, he said. You have told me its nature, Holmes replied. Not its scope.
Or not its names. Amberley's silence was answer enough. Holmes straightened. Very well, said he. Then I shall supply the missing piece myself. Lestrade looked up sharply. You know it? I know enough, Holmes replied. Consider a report detailing financial irregularities within colonial administration, significant sums diverted, men of influence implicated. Such a report would threaten not merely reputations, but positions of power. He began to pace slowly. A man in such a position, one whose name appears within that report, would have both motive and means to recover it. He would possess influence within government offices, access to records, and the ability to compel subordinates, such as Mr. Lethbridge, to act on his behalf. Amberley's hands gripped the edge of the desk. You speak as though you know him. Holmes stopped.
I do, said he quietly. A silence fell. Who is it? Lestrade demanded. Holmes turned his gaze toward Amberley. The question, Inspector, said he, is not whether I know, but whether Mr. Amberley will confirm. All eyes turned to our host. Amberley's face had grown ashen. You cannot prove— and he began. I can prove, Holmes said calmly, that you retained the document as leverage, not merely for protection, but for advantage. You intended to use it, did you not? Amberley's lips trembled slightly. I sought only to ensure my security. Holmes's voice remained even. And in doing so, you made yourself a liability. The man whose name heads that report could not allow you to exist, not while you possessed that knowledge. Amberley closed his eyes briefly, then spoke in a low voice. Lord Halberton, he said.
Lestrade gave a sharp exclamation. Halberton, a cabinet minister. Holmes inclined his head. A man of considerable influence, said he, a man whose reach extends into the very systems we have seen manipulated. It is he who required the document, and he who set this sequence in motion. And Lethbridge? I asked. A useful instrument, Holmes replied. Placed within the registry office, capable of inserting the false record, removing it when necessary, and ensuring that any discovery, such as Mr. Pembroke's, was swiftly contained. Lestrade frowned. But why the elaborate business with the record? Why not simply silence Amberley and be done with it? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Because Lord Halberton does not act merely to achieve his ends, he acts to secure them beyond question. A simple murder invites investigation. But a murder foretold, recorded in advance, creates confusion, misdirection, and delay. It ensures that by the time the truth is pursued, the trail has grown cold. And you disrupted that, I said. Holmes gave a slight smile. I introduced a contradiction, said he, a deviation from the expected course, and in doing so I forced his hand, though only partially. Lestrade straightened. Then we must arrest him at once. Holmes raised a hand. With what evidence? Said he. Suspicion. Association. The testimony of a subordinate who will deny everything? Lestrade hesitated. Holmes continued. No, Inspector. We must proceed with precision. The document itself, if recovered, would suffice. Without it, we have only inference. Amberley looked up suddenly. The document, he said. It was not destroyed. Holmes's gaze sharpened.
No? Amberley shook his head. I anticipated the possibility of its theft. The copy taken from the safe was not the only one. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "You retained another?" said he. "Yes." "Where?" Amberley hesitated only a moment. "In a deposit box at a private bank." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Then, Inspector," said he, "we have what we require." Lestrade's face lit with renewed determination. "I'll have a warrant within the hour." Holmes inclined his head. "And with it," he said, "the means to conclude this affair properly." Amberley sank back into his chair, the tension draining from him at last. "And I?" he asked quietly. Holmes regarded him with a measured expression. "You, Mr. Amberley," said he, "have been both victim and participant. Your prudence preserved the evidence, but your ambition invited the danger." Amberley bowed his head. "I understand." Holmes turned toward the door. "Come, Watson," said he, "our work here is nearly complete." It was some days later that the matter reached its conclusion. The document, once recovered, proved as damning as Holmes had anticipated. Lord Halberton's involvement could no longer be denied, and though the proceedings were conducted with the utmost discretion, his fall was both swift and decisive. Lethbridge, confronted with the evidence, offered little resistance. Pembroke was reinstated, his integrity at last recognized. And Amberley, though spared the fate so carefully prepared for him, retired from public life entirely. As for Holmes, he seemed curiously indifferent to the outcome.
"You have unravelled a most extraordinary case," I said to him one evening, as we sat once more in Baker Street. "A crime recorded before it occurred, a design intended to shape the future itself." Holmes waved a hand lightly. "Not the future, Watson," said he, "only the perception of it." He rose and took up his violin. "The mistake," he continued, "was to believe that events, once written, must unfold accordingly. But the future is not a document, it is a possibility." He drew the bow across the strings, and a low, thoughtful note filled the room. "And possibility," said Sherlock Holmes, "admits of revision." I could not help but smile, for in that moment, as the music rose softly through the lamplit air, it seemed to me that no matter how intricate the design, no matter how carefully the future might be written, there would always remain, somewhere within it, a space for Holmes to intervene. And that perhaps was the one certainty no adversary could ever account for.